The Alpha King's gaze, sharp as obsidian, swept over her, and the great hall fell silent, the air thick with the scent of rain and blood. He was a conqueror, a man forged in the crucible of war, and she was the silent offering meant to appease him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the cavern of her chest, but no sound could pass her lips. As he descended the throne, each step echoing like a death knell, she braced for the end. But when he stopped before her, he didn't draw his sword. Instead, he lifted a hand, scarred and formidable, and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. In that moment, his touch was not one of a captor, but of something far more dangerous, something that could shatter her world more completely than any blade. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The chamber was so stuffy, it felt as though the air had died years ago, left to go stale alongside the faded tapestries and forgotten victories they depicted. Dust motes danced in the single, accusatory beam of light slanting from a high, narrow window, illuminating the decay of a noble house clinging to relevance by a thread. It was here that Arwen Vale's world ended. Her father, Lord Vale, a man whose ambition had long ago outstripped his means, stood before the hearth, his back to the cold, empty fireplace. He would not meet her eyes. His voice, when it came, was a hollow boom of false bravado, echoing in the oppressive quiet. "You will be a queen, Arwen," he declared to the room at large, his words painting a grand picture over a canvas of wrought. "Queen of the most powerful kingdom in the realm." He finally risked a glance at her, his expression a desperate plea for her to see the genius of his plan, the salvation he had secured. The marriage was a treaty, he explained, a holy union that would save their failing lands from the conqueror at their borders. King Rowan Thorne of the Northern Isles would have their allegiance, sealed not with a signature, but with a daughter. Arwen stood perfectly still, a statue carved from ice and dread. Her hands, hidden in the worn folds of her simple wool dress, were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. A cold wave washed over her, so profound it threatened to pull her under. She did not plead. She did not weep, she did not make a sound. Her silence had been her lifelong prison, and now it was the seal on her doom. But inside, her mind was a tempest, a single, desperate question screaming into the void. Asterisk. Why? Asterisk. She fixed her gaze on her father, her eyes wide, begging him for an answer he was too cowardly to give. She was his daughter, yet she was being traded like a bushel of grain. Her stepmother, perched on a threadbare settee, offered a thin, cruel smile. Her eyes, cold as winter frost, raked over Arwen with undisguised contempt. "A pity you cannot express your gratitude," she purred, her voice dripping with venom. "A silent queen for a savage king, how fitting." The words were a physical blow, stealing the last of the air from Arwen's lungs. A savage king, the wolf of the north, that was what they called him. A ruthless warrior who had carved his throne from the bones of his enemies. And she, the silent lamb, was being sent to his den. The suffocating silence of the room pressed in, broken only by her father's hollow pronouncements and her stepmother's satisfied sighs. It was a cage, this silence, and the bars had just been locked. The journey to the Iron Keep was a descent into a new kind of isolation. The carriage ride was a blur of green hills and familiar forests, the gentle beauty of her home rendered painful by the knowledge that she would never see it again. She watched it all disappear through the small, grimy window, each mile a stitch sewing her fate closed. Her only companions were two grim-faced guards, men from her own father's service who now treated her like cargo. They spoke to each other in gruff, clipped tones, their words about weather and road conditions, but they never once spoke to her. She was already a ghost. When they reached the coast, the carriage was exchanged for a ship. The sea that greeted them was not the sparkling blue of storybooks, but a churning, furious gray, its waves clawing at the sky. The air turned sharp, biting with the cold promise of the north. Arwen stood on the deck, the sea spray cold and sharp on her face, a physical manifestation of the terror that had taken root in her heart. This felt like an ending. The world she knew was gone, a faint line on the horizon, and ahead lay only the unknown. She slipped a hand into her pocket, her fingers closing around a small, smooth stone. It was from her mother's garden, a place of warmth and laughter she could barely remember. The stone was the only piece of that life she had left, a tiny anchor in a world that was pulling her out to sea. The journey was long, giving her far too much time to dwell on the terrifying tales she had heard of King Rowan, the man who had claimed his throne through bloodshed, a warrior who had never known peace. The creak of the ship's timbers, the mournful cry of the gulls, the roar of the wind, they were a symphony of sounds she could hear but never add to. Her world was one of observation, not participation, and she was now observing the approach of her own grim future. The Iron Keep did not rise from the landscape. It dominated it. It was a formidable structure of dark, jagged stone, perched on a cliff's edge as if it had clawed its way out of the very rock, a fortress built to defy the stormy sea that crashed relentlessly against its base. Torches flickered in the biting wind, their light struggling against the encroaching twilight, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. The air itself was different here, thick with the smells of salt, smoke, and wet stone, a primal scent that spoke of war and survival. Arwen was met not by the king, but by a man whose face was a roadmap of old battles. He introduced himself as Kale, the king's second in command, his voice a low gravel that seemed scraped from the stones around them. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, assessed her with a critical, unreadable gaze that made her feel like a flawed jewel being inspected for its worth. "The king will see you in the great hall," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do not stray." He led her through the castle, and Arwen's senses were overwhelmed. This was no place of comfort or courtly grace. It was a place of war. The clatter of armor echoed in the stone corridors. The low murmur of gruff voices filled the air, and everywhere she looked were soldiers, their faces hard, their bodies honed for battle. They stopped and stared as she passed, this small, silent figure in a simple dress. Their expressions were a mixture of raw curiosity, a touch of pity, and a heavy dose of suspicion. She was the outsider, the price of a treaty with a weak southern lord. She kept her eyes downcast, her posture rigid with a tension that was almost painful, her hands clutching the small stone in her pocket so tightly she could feel its edges digging into her palm. She felt like a fragile doll being paraded through a giant's fortress, a thing to be looked at, perhaps broken, but never understood. The fear that had been her constant companion on the journey solidified into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and fire. A massive fireplace roared at the far end, its flames leaping and casting a hungry, flickering light on the scene. From the high, smoke-darkened rafters hung banners, and on each was the same sigil, a snarling black wolf, its teeth bared in a silent promise of violence. At the center of it all, upon a dais, was a throne. It was not the gilded, jewel-encrusted seat of the southern kings, but a throne of dark wood and black iron, as stark and unforgiving as the land itself. And on that throne sat the Alpha King. He was larger than she had imagined, broader of shoulder, with an aura of immense, controlled power that seemed to suck the very air towards him. He was not moving, yet he was the most vital thing in the room. As Kale led her forward, the low hum of conversation died, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Every eye was on her. Arwen walked the long path to the dais, each step an eternity, the sound of her own frantic heartbeat deafening in her ears. She reached the bottom of the steps and performed the required curtsy, her body trembling with a tremor she could not control. Then he rose. The movement was fluid, predatory, a lion unfolding from rest. He descended the steps, his gaze never leaving her, and the intensity of it was a physical force. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she was forced to crane her neck to look up at his face. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, gray and turbulent, and they were fixed on her. This was it. The wolf of the north, face to face with the broken dove his enemies had sent him. His voice, when it came, was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the soles of her feet and up her spine. "They sent me a broken dove." He did not say it cruelly or with anger, but as a simple, unadorned statement of fact. The words hung in the air, a final confirmation of her worthlessness. She braced herself for the dismissal, the contempt, the cold command that would send her to some forgotten room to live out her days as a prisoner. But that is not what happened. Instead, he lifted a hand, a large, calloused hand bearing the scars of 100 battles. He moved with an impossible slowness, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he meant to strike her. But his hand came to rest not on her throat, but on her cheek. His touch was surprisingly, shockingly gentle. With a tenderness that felt utterly alien in this place of iron and stone, he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his thumb grazing her skin. The contact was electric, a spark of warmth in the frozen landscape of her fear. Her terror was still there, a wild bird beating its wings in her chest, but now it was joined by a new, bewildering sensation. A flicker of confusion, a spark of intense curiosity. His gaze was not just looking at her, she realized. It felt as though it were looking times into times her, past the silence, past the fear, into the very heart of the girl who had no voice. Kale escorted her from the hall, his silence a heavy cloak. The chambers she was shown to were fit for the queen she was supposed to be, yet they felt more like a luxurious prison than a home. The space was vast, with a high, vaulted ceiling from which hung a heavy iron chandelier. Rich tapestries, unlike the faded rags in her father's castle, covered the stone walls, their threads depicting fierce northern hunts and epic sea voyages, scenes of a vibrant, brutal life that was utterly alien to her. A massive bed, piled high with furs and velvet, dominated one wall, and a fire had been lit in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow that did little to dispel the room's intrinsic coldness. But it was the window that captured her attention. It was a grand, arched opening, larger than any she had ever seen, offering a stunning, terrifying panorama of the churning sea below. The waves, black and silver under the moonlight, crashed against the cliffs with a relentless, thunderous roar. It was the sound of untamed power, a constant, deafening reminder of the king who now owned her. An elderly woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple and eyes full of a surprising gentleness was waiting for her. She curtsied low, her movements slow but steady. "I am Alara, my lady," she said, her voice soft and soothing, a stark contrast to the gruff tones of the soldiers and the dangerous rumble of the king. "I have been assigned to be your handmaiden. If you need anything, anything at all, you need only gesture. I am old, but my eyes are sharp." Arwen simply stared, unused to such kindness. She explored the room, a ghost in her own life, running a hand over the cool, carved wood of a wardrobe, the plush velvet of a chair. It was all beautiful, a gilded cage built to hold a songbird that could not sing. She returned to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass, watching the endless war between sea and stone. She felt as trapped as a ship caught in a tempest, her future a maelstrom of uncertainty. After a long moment, she turned back to the patient servant. She gave Alara a small, hesitant nod, a flicker of acknowledgement, of thanks. It was her first attempt at communication in this cold, new world. A tiny, silent word that felt as heavy as a shout. Alara's kind eyes crinkled in a soft smile of understanding. It was a small flicker of warmth, a potential alliance in a land of ice and iron. Her first dinner at the high table was an exercise in invisibility. She was seated to Rowan's right, a place of honor that felt like a pillory. The great hall, which had been so silent upon her arrival, was now a roaring beast of noise and energy. The king's inner circle, Kale and a dozen other high-ranking warriors with scarred faces and boisterous laughs, filled the space with their presence. They talked of battle and strategy, of trade routes and the price of steel, their voices loud and confident. They drank ale from heavy tankards, slamming them on the thick oak table for emphasis, their laughter a physical assault on Arwen's senses. No one spoke to her. No one even looked at her, save for the occasional curious glance from a serving boy. She was a phantom at the feast, a queen in name only. Rowan sat at the head of the table, a mountain of quiet command amidst the storm of his men. He ate and drank with a focused intensity, his presence a palpable weight. He would make a low comment to Kael now and then, his words swallowed by the surrounding din. But for the most part, he was as silent as she was. Yet, she felt his eyes on her. It was not a constant stare, but a series of heavy, assessing glances, as if he were a wolf studying a strange new creature that had wandered into his territory. The weight of his gaze was physical, a pressure on her skin that made it difficult to breathe. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, the rich roasted meat and spiced wine turning to ash in her mouth. She ate little, her movements small and precise, a stark contrast to the hearty, unrestrained manner of the men around her. The smell of meat and ale, the roar of 100 conversations, the glint of firelight on the blades worn at every man's hip. It was a sensory overload that left her feeling dizzy and profoundly alone. She was the queen, yet she was a ghost at her own table, an object placed for display, her silence making her less than nothing to these men of action and words. Rowan's observation was the only thing that acknowledged her existence, and it was not comforting. It was watchful, analytical. He was studying her, she realized with a fresh wave of fear, trying to understand the broken dove his enemies had sent him. In the days that followed, Arwen learned the art of being invisible. She moved through the cold stone corridors of the Iron Keep like a whisper, her soft shoes making no sound, her presence barely registering on the boisterous inhabitants. It was during one of these aimless, desperate explorations for a moment of peace that she found it. Tucked away in a forgotten wing of the castle, behind an unassuming iron, banded door, was a world of impossible green. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the air changed. It was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. It was a conservatory, its roof made of thick, bubbled glass that let the pale northern sun filter through, creating a soft, ethereal light. The contrast with the rest of the fortress was so stark it made her gasp, though no sound came out. Here, delicate plants with broad, waxy leaves and flowers of vibrant, impossible color grew in defiance of the harsh climate outside. There were crimson blossoms that smelled of spice, trailing vines with tiny star-shaped white flowers, and ferns that unfurled in delicate green spirals. It was a secret, a pocket of warmth and life hidden within the heart of the stone beast. For the first time since leaving her home, Arwen let her guard down. She moved between the terracotta pots, her fingers gently tracing the edge of a leaf. Her head tilted as she inhaled the sweet perfume of a flower that reminded her of her mother's garden. A smile, small and fragile but entirely genuine, touched her lips. She found a simple stone bench tucked behind a curtain of ivy and sat, closing her eyes. The roar of the sea was muted here, the clamor of the castle non-existent. For a moment, she was not a captive queen, not a silent offering. She was just Arwen, a girl in a garden. Unseen by her, standing in the deep shadows of the entrance, was Rowan. He had followed her, his initial motive a mix of suspicion and a restless curiosity he couldn't name. He had seen her flitting through his castle like a pale moth, and had wanted to know where she went. He had expected to find her weeping in some secluded corner. He did not expect this. He watched as the tension melted from her shoulders, as the rigid mask of fear was replaced by a look of serene peace. He saw the grace in her movements as she touched a petal with a reverence he had only ever seen men give to a perfectly balanced sword. He saw the deep, profound sadness that always swam in her eyes briefly lift, replaced by a light he had not known was possible. In that moment, he saw not the political pawn, not the broken dove, but a person, fragile and yet resilient. He saw a flicker of her inner beauty, a quiet strength that her silence had hidden from everyone. He turned and left as silently as he had come, his heart pounding with a strange new rhythm. His fascination had just begun. The discovery of the garden became her salvation, but it also sharpened the edges of her captivity. It was a taste of freedom that made the rest of the cage unbearable. The silent dinners, the long, empty hours in her opulent chambers, the feeling of being constantly watched by a king who never spoke to her, it all began to press in on her with a renewed weight. A desperate need for some semblance of agency, some way to push back against the crushing helplessness, began to burn within her. She could not speak, but she was not thoughtless. She had a mind, a will, a spirit that refused to be completely extinguished. That night, as a storm began to brew over the sea, its low rumble a prelude to the tempest in her own soul, she made a decision. She found Alara mending a tunic by the fire in her chambers. Arwen approached her hesitantly, then, gathering her courage, she mimed the act of writing, her finger scratching against her opposite palm. Alara looked up, her kind eyes studying Arwen's intense expression. She understood immediately. Without a single question, The old servant rose and shuffled to a large chest, retrieving a small, smooth piece of slate, a few sticks of charcoal, and a soft cloth for erasing. She placed them on the heavy wooden desk near the window, giving Arwen a look of quiet encouragement before returning to her seat by the fire, granting her the illusion of privacy. Arwen sat at the desk, the blank, dark surface of the slate a daunting challenge. What could she possibly say? Who would even listen? Her first instinct was to plead, to beg to be sent home, but she knew the futility of that. She was a queen, a treaty sealed in flesh. Instead, her hand moved, the charcoal gritty against the stone. She wrote a question, not for the king, not for Alara, but for herself, a desperate attempt to anchor her identity in this overwhelming place. Asterisk, who am I in this place? Asterisk. The words stared back at her, a stark testament to her profound dislocation. She wiped them away with the cloth, her heart aching. Then, with a new resolve, she began again. This time, she would not ask for the impossible. She would ask for the possible. She began to write a list, her charcoal moving with a newfound purpose. Asterisk. A book to read. Permission to walk in the garden again. A needle and thread. Asterisk. Simple things. Small things. It was a tiny act of defiance, a declaration that she was more than just a silent doll. It was her voice, scratched in dust on a piece of stone, and as the storm broke outside, the sound of the scratching was the only sound in the room, a quiet rebellion against a world that had tried to silence her completely. Arwen woke to a room washed in the pale, clean light of morning. The storm had passed, leaving the air feeling scoured and new. For a moment, suspended between sleep and waking, she felt a sliver of peace. Then the reality of her situation returned. The weight of the iron keep, the silent king, her gilded cage. She sat up, pulling the heavy furs around her shoulders, and her eyes fell upon the small table beside her bed. She froze. Where last night there had been only her slate and charcoal, there now sat a small, neat stack of 3 leather-bound books. And lying beside them, a single, perfect white flower, its petals still glistening with dew. It was from the conservatory. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She crept from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She touched the books first, her fingers tracing the worn leather spines. He had read her list. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He had acknowledged her silent request. But the flower, that was something else entirely. The books were a simple fulfillment of a demand, an act a master might grant a favored pet. The flower was personal. It was a message, a silent acknowledgement that he had not just read her list. He had seen her. He had been there, in the garden, watching her. The memory of her brief, unguarded peace in the conservatory was now tainted with the knowledge of his eyes upon her. Just then, the door opened softly, and Alara entered, carrying a tray with steaming water and fresh linens. The old servant's eyes went from Arwen's stunned face to the items on the table, and a knowing, gentle smile touched her lips. "The king has granted you access to the conservatory whenever you wish, my lady," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "He said the light in there is good for reading." Arwen picked up the flower, its stem cool against her trembling fingers. She brought it to her nose, inhaling its faint, sweet scent. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Was this an act of kindness, a gesture of understanding? Or was it another form of control, a reminder that even in her most private moments, she was being watched? A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, warred with the deep-seated fear she held for the formidable man she had married. The flower was a silent word, a response in a language only they seemed to share, and she did not yet know how to interpret its meaning. The great hall was less formal that evening, the long tables filled with vassal lords and captains drinking and talking in loud, rumbling voices. Arwen sat beside Rowan, a silent, decorative presence as always. She had grown accustomed to the noise, learning to retreat into the quiet fortress of her own mind. But tonight, the fortress was breached. A visiting lord from the southern border, a brutish, red-faced man named Gunnar, whose ambition was plain to see, had been drinking heavily. He was posturing, trying to gain favor and prove his mettle amongst the king's hardened warriors. He laughed, a loud, braying sound, and slapped his thigh. A quiet queen is a blessing, I suppose. He boomed, his eyes sliding towards Arwen with a greasy, appraising look. No nagging, eh? Though one wonders what other duties she is capable of. The words, crude and dismissive, sliced through the din of the hall. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the nearby tables. Every head turned. Arwen flinched as if he had struck her, the color draining from her face. It was the casual cruelty of it, the reduction of her to a mere function, a mute vessel. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. Before Kale, ever watchful at Rowan's other side, could even straighten from his seat, Rowan moved. He did not shout, he did not rise with theatrical fury. He was simply on his feet, moving with a lethal, fluid speed that was terrifying to behold. In 2 silent strides, he was upon Lord Gunnar. He grabbed the front of the man's tunic, lifting him effortlessly from the bench until Gunnar's feet dangled inches from the floor. The larger man's face went from a drunken sneer to a mask of pure, sober terror. Rowan's voice was not loud. It was a deadly calm, a low growl that vibrated with barely contained violence, meant only for Gunnar but heard by all in the ringing silence. "She is your queen," he said, his stormy eyes boring into the terrified lords. "And you have just forgotten your last lesson in etiquette. Let me give you another." With a flick of his wrist, as if tossing aside a piece of trash, he threw Lord Gunnar halfway across the hall. The man landed in a heap of sprawling limbs and terrified gasps, scrambling away like a beaten dog. Rowan turned back to the stunned court, his gaze sweeping over them, cold and hard as iron. "The next person who shows my wife any disrespect will not be thrown out," he stated, his voice resonating with absolute authority. "They will be buried." He let the threat hang in the air, a chilling promise. Then, his eyes found Arwen's. The blazing fury was still there, but as his gaze held hers, it was tempered by something else, something fierce and protective. It was a look that claimed her, that shielded her, that wrapped her in an invisible cloak of his power. He held her gaze for a long, charged moment before returning to his seat as if nothing had happened, leaving the hall in a state of profound shock. Arwen's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of both terror and a strange, new feeling. For the first time in her life, she felt defended. He had not just defended his honor or his possession. In his own brutal, terrifying way, he had defended her. And in the eyes of the court, the silent queen suddenly had a voice, and it was the roar of a wolf. Later that evening, Arwen sought refuge in her sanctuary. The conservatory was quiet, the moonlight filtering through the glass roof, painting the leaves and petals in shades of silver and gray. She was trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart, her hands buried in the cool, damp earth of a planter, the scent of blossoms a soothing balm. She was still reeling from the violence, from the raw, possessive fury Rowan had unleashed on her behalf. The door creaked open, and she looked up, her body instantly tensing. It was Rowan. He filled the doorway, a dark, imposing silhouette against the torchlight of the corridor. She expected him to speak, to demand something, perhaps to explain his actions. She braced herself. Instead, he entered the garden and the door swung shut behind him, plunging them into the soft, lunar light. He did not approach her. He simply walked to the stone bench where she had sat before and lowered his large frame onto it, his movements deliberate and quiet. He said nothing. He just sat, watching her. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant sigh of the sea. But this silence was different. It was not the oppressive, suffocating quiet of her father's castle, nor the isolating, lonely quiet of the dinner table. This was a shared silence, a conscious choice. It was peaceful. After a long while, with her heart still pounding, but for an entirely different reason, Arwen gathered her courage. She wiped her earthy hands on her dress and picked up the slate and charcoal she now carried with her everywhere in a small leather pouch at her belt. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote, the scratching of the charcoal loud in the stillness. She wrote 2 words, the most important words she had ever formed. "Thank you." She stood and walked towards him, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. She felt impossibly vulnerable as she held the slate out to him. He looked down, his large, scarred hand coming up to steady the slate she held. His eyes, which had been so full of fury hours before, were now calm and deep as a forest pool. He read the words, a flicker of some unreadable emotion passed through their depths. A subtle shift in the hard lines of his face. He did not smile, but the severity of his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He looked from the slate to her face, his gaze intense, searching. Then, he gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement. It was a conversation, their first true, two-way conversation, and not a single word had been spoken aloud. In that moment, he was not a king demanding tribute, and she was not a broken offering. They were simply a man and a woman, sitting in a moonlit garden, beginning to learn a language all their own. He was meeting her in her world of silence, and it was a more profound gesture of acceptance than any pretty vow or loud declaration could ever be. The castle was settling into the deep quiet of the late night when Arwen found she could not sleep. The events of the day played over and over in her mind, a confusing tapestry of public violence and private peace. A restless energy propelled her from her bed. She found Alara dozing in a chair outside her chambers, a silent guardian. Arwen touched the old woman's shoulder gently, then mimed a question, her brows furrowed, her head tilted towards the direction of the king's wing. Alara, ever perceptive, understood. She nodded and led Arwen through the sleeping castle, her soft slippers whispering on the stones, until they stood before a heavy oak door. Alara gave her a reassuring pat on the arm and retreated, leaving Arwen alone. Hesitantly, she pushed the door open. It led to Rowan's private study. The room was Spartan, a soldier's space. There were no rich tapestries here, only walls lined with shelves of books and rolled maps. A massive table dominated the center, covered in strategic charts, and weapons were racked neatly along one wall. Rowan was there, his back to her. He was shirtless, and the firelight played over the powerful muscles and intricate network of old silvery scars that covered his back and shoulders. He was hunched over, clumsily trying to stitch a long, shallow cut on his left forearm. A wound from a training spar, she presumed. He swore under his breath, a low, frustrated sound. She entered without a sound, but he sensed her presence immediately, his head snapping up. He turned, his expression one of surprise and a hint of annoyance. "This is no place for you," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was a dismissal, a gruff attempt to shield his moment of vulnerability. Arwen ignored his words. Her eyes were fixed on the poorly stitched wound, which was still oozing blood. Her mother, a gentle soul who had known much of herbs and healing, had taught her these things long ago. Without a second thought, she walked towards him. She reached his side and gently but firmly took the needle and bloody cloth from his surprised grasp. She looked at the wound, then at him, her expression clear and determined. She gestured for him to sit in the large leather chair by the fire. For a moment, he just stared at her, his stormy eyes wide with shock. This silent, timid girl was giving him an order. A king who was never questioned, never touched without permission, was being commanded by a gesture. A slow, grudging respect dawned in his eyes, followed by a weary acceptance. He did as she bid, sinking into the chair and extending his arm. She knelt before him, her proximity both intimate and unnerving. She carefully pulled out his clumsy stitches, cleaned the wound with a cloth dipped in wine from a nearby carafe, and began to sew the skin together with small, neat stitches, her movements deft and sure. The air was thick with unspoken things. Her fingers brushed against his warm skin, and she felt a tremor go through him, or perhaps it was her own hand that trembled. He watched her the entire time, his gaze an intense, burning weight, tracing the line of her bent head, the curve of her cheek, the focused concentration in her eyes. He was a king used to giving orders, to being in absolute control, yet he had submitted to her care. And she, who had been powerless her entire life, was in this moment in control, her gentle skill mending the flesh of the most powerful man she had ever known. It was a profound reversal of their roles, a quiet act of trust that stitched them together more securely than any thread. The weight of command settled over the war room, as thick and suffocating as the smoke from the beeswax candles that dripped onto the massive central table. Maps, crisscrossed with lines of strategy and stained with spilled wine, were spread across its surface, a paper battlefield where the fate of the Northern Isles was being debated. Rowan stood at its head, his fist planted on the coast of his own kingdom, his knuckles white. The mood was tense, the air crackling with a frustration that emanated from the king like heat from a forge. He had been discussing the recent raids on their southern coastline, a series of bold and unnervingly successful attacks by a rival warlord, Lord Valerius. They were losing ships, cargo, and men at a rate that suggested more than just bad luck. They know our patrol routes. Rowan's voice was a low growl, a dangerous counterpoint to the crackling fire in the hearth. They know when our ships are away for refitting. They strike with a precision that stinks of inside knowledge. There is a traitor in this castle. His fist hit the table, a sharp percussive sound that made one of the younger commanders flinch. Pale, his face a grim mask carved from granite, stood beside him. We've questioned everyone, my king. The portmaster, the watch commanders, the families of the men we lost. No one has broken. There are no whispers, no boasts in the taverns. Arwen sat in a deep window seat, a book open on her lap, a prop to justify her presence. Since the incident in the Great Hall, her attendance at these councils was tolerated, if not exactly welcomed. She was the queen, a silent fixture, and the commanders had learned to speak around her as if she were part of the furniture. But she was not reading. Her eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. She listened intently, not just to the words but to the currents beneath them. She watched the faces of the men as Rowan spoke, the flicker of an eyelid, the tightening of a jaw, the way one captain refused to meet the king's gaze while another met it with a shade too much bravado. She was no longer just the frightened girl from the Vale, cowering in the face of her fate. She was the queen of this castle, this kingdom. A threat to it was a threat to the fragile peace she had found, a threat to the man who had defended her, who had placed a flower by her bed, who was slowly, terrifyingly, capturing her heart. Her fear was no longer just for herself. It had expanded to encompass the stone walls around her, and the wolf who ruled them. She scanned the faces again, a silent catalogue of loyalties and ambitions. Lord Gunnar was there, his expression sullen, his face still bearing a faint bruise from his unceremonious exit from the hall. He caught her watching him, and his lip curled in a faint sneer before he looked away. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, trickled down Arwen's spine. She told herself it was just his lingering resentment, but her instincts, honed by a lifetime of silent observation, screamed that it was something more. Days later, seeking the calming scent of salt and the open air, Arwen was walking along a covered arcade that overlooked the main training courtyard. The clang of steel on steel was a familiar rhythm now, the soundtrack to her new life. She kept to the shadows, a habit she had never quite broken. Below, new recruits were being drilled by a grizzled sergeant, their grunts and curses rising on the wind. She saw Lord Gunnar walking with another man, a portly courtier with shifty eyes, whom she recognized from the war council. They were speaking in low, urgent tones, their heads close together. Arwen instinctively drew back further into the shadows of a thick stone archway, her presence completely concealed. Gunnar's voice drifted up to her, a venomous whisper that cut through the sounds of the courtyard. Valerius grows impatient. He paid for a clear route, not a series of near misses. The other man wrung his hands, his face pale and sweaty despite the cool sea breeze. The king suspects someone. He watches everyone. The king is distracted. Gunnar spat, and his next words made Arwen's blood turn to ice. His new pet may be silent, but she has his ear. He looks at her in a way I've never seen. If she becomes a problem, if she sees something she shouldn't. He left the threat hanging in the air, as sharp and deadly as a drawn blade. The other man muttered something about the risks, then noticed a pair of guards rounding the far end of the courtyard. The two conspirators separated at once, melting back into the daily bustle of the castle as if they had merely been exchanging pleasantries. Arwen stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold, rough stone of the archway. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a sickening thud of terror. It was not a guess, it was not a suspicion. It was a confirmation, spoken aloud, of treason. Gunnar, the man Rowan had humiliated for her sake, was the traitor. And now, she was not just an observer, she was a target. The king's pet, The casual, dismissive cruelty of the term was a stark reminder of how they saw her, how little she mattered. She had to tell Rowan. She had to get this information to him, this poison that was eating away at his kingdom from the inside. But how? Who could she trust to carry a message? The man Gunnar had been speaking to was one of Rowan's own counselors. The web of betrayal was wider than she knew. Fear, cold and absolute, wrapped around her throat, silencing her more completely than ever before. That night, a storm broke over the Iron Keep, a furious assault of wind and rain that rattled the thick glass of her chamber window. The turmoil outside was a perfect mirror for the tempest raging within her. She paced the length of her room, from the warmth of the fire to the cold draft of the window, her mind a frantic race of fear and indecision. She had to warn him. She could not let Gunnar's treachery succeed. She could not let him be harmed. She snatched her slate from the table, her hands shaking so badly that the first lines she scratched were jagged and illegible. She wiped it clean and tried again, forcing her fingers to obey. Asterisk, Gunnar is the traitor. He speaks with Valerius. I heard him. Asterisk. The words stared back at her, stark and damning. But what if someone else found it? What if she gave it to Alara, and the old woman was stopped? What if she left it for Rowan, and a servant loyal to Gunnar discovered it first? A written message was a tangible thing. It was proof, but it was also a weapon that could be turned against her. It would be her word, the silent, scribbled accusation of a foreign girl who was seen as little more than a pet against a powerful, established lord of the Isles. They would say she was mistaken. They would say she was mad or malicious, seeking revenge for a public insult. She threw the slate onto the bed in frustration and seized a piece of parchment and a stick of charcoal instead. A letter could be sealed. She wrote it all out, the words tumbling from her in a desperate, messy scrawl. She described the conversation, the mention of Valerius, the threat against her. She signed her name, a shaky, unfamiliar signature. She folded the parchment, her heart pounding. But who would deliver it? Cale? He was loyal to Rowan, but he had also been skeptical of her. She remembered the doubt in his eyes when Rowan had trusted her. Could she risk the fate of the kingdom on his willingness to believe her now? Her gaze fell to the fire, its flames leaping and dancing in the hearth. With a sob of pure frustration, she crumpled the parchment in her fist. The desperation of having a voice, of knowing the truth, but having no safe way to make it heard, was a unique and exquisite form of torture. She walked to the fireplace and opened her hand, letting the crumpled ball of parchment fall into the flames. She watched as the edges blackened and curled, as the names and accusations turned to gray, weightless ash and were carried up the chimney into the storm. Her secret was safe, but so was the traitor. She felt trapped and powerless all over again, but this time it was infinitely worse. It was not just her own safety at stake, but the safety of the kingdom, and the life of the king who had shown her a terrifying, unexpected kindness. Sleep was an impossibility. The secret she held was a burning coal in her gut. She could not write it, she could not speak it, but she could not keep it. There had to be another way. An idea, born of sheer desperation, began to form in her mind, a wild, desperate gambit that made her heart pound with a mixture of terror and resolve. She had to show him, not tell him, show him. It was well past midnight when she slipped from her room. The castle was silent, the only sounds the howling of the wind and the distant roar of the sea. She moved through the darkened corridors like a wraith, her destination clear. She did not hesitate at the door to his study, pushing it open without being summoned. Rowan was there, just as she knew he would be. He was seated at his great map table, the candlelight casting deep shadows across his weary, focused face. He looked up as she entered, his expression hardening with surprise and a flicker of wary concern. "Arwen, what is it? Are you unwell?" She shook her head, closing the door behind her and leaning against it for a moment to still the trembling in her limbs. She did not go to her pouch for her slate. Words were too dangerous, too easily dismissed. She walked towards the table, her eyes scanning its surface. On a small side table was a game of strategy, a northern version of chess, with intricately carved wooden figures, wolves and bears and ravens. Her gaze landed on them, and her plan solidified. She approached the main map table, her heart in her throat. Rowan watched her, his eyes narrowed in confusion and intense concentration, sensing the urgency that radiated from her. She reached for the game pieces. First, she picked up a large, snarling wolf, the king piece of Rowan's army. She placed it firmly on the map, on the location of the Iron Keep. Then, she took a handful of smaller, cruder pieces, the raiders. She placed them on the map at the territory of Lord Valerius. Then, with a trembling finger, she traced the patrol route of a northern ship, and with her other hand, she moved the raider pieces to intercept it, enacting the successful attacks. Rowan watched, his jaw tight. He understood the metaphor so far. Losses, he murmured, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, her eyes fixed on his, willing him to understand. Now for the crucial part. She picked up a third piece. It was a dark, ugly pawn, a twisted piece of wood that represented a spy or an assassin in the game. She held it up for him to see. Then she placed it on the map, right beside his king piece, inside the walls of the Iron Keep. A traitor in their midst. She then moved the pawn slowly, deliberately, across the map, from the side of the Wolf King to the side of the raiders, touching one of the enemy pieces. Then, just as slowly, she moved it back. A secret messenger. A traitor, Rowan breathed, the words a puff of cold air. His eyes were blazing with a focused intensity. He understood. Arwen nodded frantically, her relief so profound it almost made her knees buckle. But she wasn't finished. Who? How could she tell him who? Her eyes darted around the room, searching for inspiration. They landed on a silver wine goblet on a side table, identical to the one Lord Gunnar had been drinking from on the night he had insulted her. The night Rowan had defended her. It was a long shot, a subtle clue tied to a shared memory of violence and humiliation. She picked up the ugly pawn, the traitor piece, and walked to the side table. She placed it deliberately, firmly, right next to the silver goblet. Then she looked back at Rowan, her expression a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He stared at the pawn, then at the goblet. His brow furrowed for a long second, his mind clearly working, connecting the pieces of the silent puzzle she had laid out for him. She saw the moment the connection was made. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of shock, then a dawning, terrible understanding. He remembered the man, the insult, the goblet raised in a drunken toast. He looked back at her, and the look in his eyes was something entirely new. The suspicion was gone. The confusion was gone. In its place was a profound, staggering respect. He did not question her. He did not ask for proof. He did not doubt. He simply looked into her soul and saw the truth she was so desperate to convey. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes clear and unwavering, and gave a single, firm nod. In the quiet of the study, with the storm raging outside, a silent girl had accused a powerful lord of treason, and a king had listened, not with his ears, but with his heart. Their partnership had been forged. Rowan's trust was a fearsome thing, as swift and uncompromising as his justice. In the immediate, ringing silence of the study, he did not move. He simply looked at Arwen, his gaze holding hers, and in that single shared look, an entire strategy was conceived, passed, and ratified. He gave her one last, sharp nod, a silent dismissal that was also a promise, and turned back to his maps. Arwen slipped from the room, her heart a wild drum against her ribs, the weight of her secret now transferred to his broad shoulders. The next morning, the war room was convened again, but the atmosphere had shifted. The restless frustration was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged purpose that emanated from the king. Only Chaol was with him. Rowan spoke in low tones, not even trusting the ancient stones of his own walls. "We will let it be known that our northern fleet is sailing for the shipyards at Blackwood Cove for repairs. The entire squadron. It will leave the bay vulnerable for a week." He traced a line on the map with his finger. "We will also let it be known that the quarterly tax collection from the southern holds, a significant amount of gold, is being moved by wagon along the old southern road 2 days from now." Chaol's scarred face was a mask of disbelief. He stared at the king as if he had gone mad. "My king, that is an immense risk. The fleet is our first line of defense, and that gold is vital. If your queen is mistaken, Rowan cut him off, his voice dropping to a low temperature that could freeze fire. She is not mistaken. He looked at his oldest friend and commander, his eyes like chips of flint. I trust her eyes more than I trust the tongues of half the men in this castle. She sees the world without the filter of words, Kale. She sees what is, not what people say there is. Set the trap. I want your most loyal men, disguised as merchants, watching the docks. And I want a full legion of our best soldiers waiting in the woods along that southern road. Kale held the king's gaze for a long moment, seeing the absolute, unshakable conviction there. He had followed Rowan into impossible battles based on less. He bowed his head. It will be done, my king. Later that day, Rowan found Arwen not in the conservatory, but on the windswept battlements overlooking the sea. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair across her face, and she did not seem to notice, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He came to stand beside her, a silent, solid presence against the gale. He said nothing for a long time, simply sharing the view with her. Then he held out his hand. Lying on his scarred palm was a small object, intricately carved from dark wood. It was a wolf, captured in mid-howl, its head thrown back, its form tense with power and life. It was a perfect, miniature replica of the sigil on his banners, a personal sigil. He took her hand, which was cold from the wind, and closed her fingers around the carving. The wood was smooth and warm from his own body heat. It was a silent promise, a symbol of his complete trust, a token that marked her as one of his own. He was bringing her into his pack. Arwen's fingers tightened around the small wolf, its sharp edges digging into her palm. A terrifying weight of responsibility settled over her, but beneath it, for the first time, she felt a surge of true belonging. She was no longer just the silent offering. She was part of the defense of this kingdom. She was the Wolf King's eyes. The bait was laid at the evening feast. The hall was boisterous, the air thick with the smell of roasted boar and spilled ale. Rowan, in a seemingly expansive mood, spoke loudly to a visiting trade envoy, his voice carrying easily over the din. A damnable inconvenience, he declared, slamming his tankard down. The entire northern fleet laid up for repairs at once. Shipwrights have no sense of timing. It leaves us damnably exposed for the next week. He then leaned in, adding in a conspiratorial tone that was just loud enough for those at the high table to hear. And with the treasury moving the southern tax hall by road, my guard is stretched thin. A king's work is never done. From her seat beside him, Arwen did not look at Rowan. Her eyes were fixed on Lord Gunnar, who was seated further down the table. She watched him through her lashes, her posture one of quiet deference, giving no sign of her intense focus. She saw him still, his drinking horn, his head tilting slightly. She saw the flicker of avarice in his eyes, a flash of greedy triumph so quick that anyone not looking for it would have missed it entirely. He quickly masked it, turning to his neighbor with a loud joke, but Arwen had seen it. The bait was not just taken, it was devoured. A grim, cold satisfaction settled in her stomach, but it was quickly followed by a rising tide of dread. This was no longer a game of silent messages and carved figures. This was real. The net was tightening, and the consequences would be written in blood. The next day, Kale sought out the king with a brief, grim report. His spies, posing as fishermen mending their nets, had observed Lord Gunnar meeting with a known smuggler at the docks, a man with deep ties to Lord Valerius. A message had been passed. The trap was working perfectly. Arwen, who was arranging flowers in the main hall when Kale arrived, saw the grim nod Rowan gave his commander. She saw the tightening of his jaw. The air in the castle grew heavier, charged with an unspoken, violent anticipation. She was no longer a passive observer. She was an active participant in the counter, espionage, and every shadow seemed to hold a new threat, every whisper a potential accusation. She felt the danger most keenly when she was alone. Her sanctuary, the conservatory, now felt exposed. To get there, she had to traverse a long, secluded corridor in a quieter wing of the castle, a passage often empty of guards. It was on her way there, as dusk was bleeding purple and orange into the sky, that the trap she had helped set sprang shut on her instead. She was halfway down the corridor. the familiar, warm scent of earth and blossoms already reaching her, when two figures stepped out of the shadows of a deep archway, blocking her path. It was Lord Gunnar, and with him was the same portly, sweating courtier she had seen him with in the courtyard. Gunnar's face was twisted into a sneer of pure venom. "The king's little mute," he whispered, his voice a sibilant hiss that slithered down her spine. "Did you think you could outsmart me? Did you think your silent stares went unnoticed?" He took a step closer, and Arwen flattened herself against the cold stone wall, her escape route cut off. "You should have stayed in your cage, little pet. Valerius pays well for a king's grief, and your death will be a message even your besotted wolf will understand." He drew a long, thin dagger from his belt, its blade glinting with a hungry light in the dim corridor. The other man stood behind him, his face pale with fear, but his body blocking any chance of retreat. Arwen was frozen, a scream building in her throat with nowhere to go. Her greatest vulnerability, the silence that had defined her entire existence, was now a fatal weakness. There was no one to hear her, no way to call for help. The corridor felt like it was closing in, the stones themselves pressing the air from her lungs. Her fight-or-flight response was a silent, frantic scream in her mind, but her body was paralyzed by sheer, visceral terror. Her hand, hidden in the folds of her dress, closed convulsively around the small wooden wolf Rowan had given her, its sharp, carved edges digging painfully into her palm, a desperate, useless anchor in a sea of fear. Just as Gunnar lunged, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty, the world exploded into a blur of savage motion. It was not a guard, it was not Kale, it was Rowan. He came out of the shadows at the far end of the hall not like a man, but like a force of nature, a storm of fury given form. He had felt a gnawing unease, a sense that something was wrong when she had not appeared for their evening meal, and his instincts, honed on 1,000 battlefields, had led him here. He moved with a speed and brutality that was breathtakingly terrifying. The fight, if it could be called that, was over in seconds. Rowan's hand shot out, catching Gunnar's dagger wrist in a grip of iron. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Gunnar shrieked, the dagger clattering to the stone floor. Rowan did not stop. He spun, his other arm catching the portly conspirator in the throat, slamming him back against the wall with enough force to knock the man unconscious. He turned back to Gunnar, who was cradling his broken wrist and weeping in agony and terror. Rowan's face was a mask of pure, unrestrained rage, his eyes blazing with a fury so intense it seemed to suck all the light from the corridor. With a guttural roar, he drove his fist into Gunnar's face, and the traitor crumpled to the ground, a broken, bloody heap. Rowan did not kill them. He incapacitated them with brutal, terrifying efficiency, leaving them for the justice that would follow. Then he turned to Arwen. His chest was heaving, his knuckles were bleeding, and his eyes were still blazing with the inferno of his rage. He rushed to her, his large hands coming up to frame her face, his touch surprisingly, desperately gentle as he searched her for any injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw and shaking, not with the aftermath of battle, but with a profound, soul-deep terror and relief. She could only shake her head, the silent scream in her throat finally dissolving into a flood of tears that streamed down her face. Tears of sheer terror, of overwhelming relief. The sight of her tears seemed to break something in him. With a sound that was half groan, half vow, he pulled her into a fierce, crushing embrace. Holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic, heavy pounding of his heart against hers, a rhythm that matched her own. He buried his face in her hair, his entire body trembling with the force of his emotion. "I will never let anyone harm you." He breathed into her hair, his voice thick and ragged. "Never." It was not a promise, it was a king's decree, a vow sworn not to the gods, but to the silent, weeping woman in his arms. In the safety of his embrace, surrounded by the wreckage of his fury, Arwen felt the last of her fear wash away, replaced by the undeniable, earth-shattering realization that this fearsome savage king, this wolf of the north, loved her. The great hall was packed, every vassal lord, captain, and courtier summoned to bear witness. The air, once thick with the scent of blood and rain upon Arwen's arrival, was now heavy with a different kind of tension, the suffocating weight of judgment, Lord Gunnar and his co-conspirators were dragged forth in heavy iron chains, their fine tunics torn and stained, their faces a mask of sullen terror. Rowan stood before the great iron and wood throne, but he was not alone. Arwen stood beside him, not behind him or below him on the steps, but at his side. Her simple wool dress had been replaced by a gown of deep forest green, the color of the conservatory, and the small wooden wolf was clutched in her hand. Her presence there was a statement, a silent declaration that echoed louder than any proclamation. Rowan let the silence stretch, his cold gaze sweeping over the assembled court, over the traitors, before he spoke, his voice ringing with the authority of a king and the finality of a judge. He laid out the evidence with cold precision. False information about the fleet, the planned ambush on the southern road, the intercepted messages from the smuggler who had, in fact, been Kale's man all along. The web of treason was laid bare for all to see. For weeks we have been bled by a snake in our midst. Rowan's voice was like steel. This snake thought his king was blind and his queen was deaf and dumb. He was wrong. He paused, turning his gaze deliberately to Arwen, and the entire hall followed his look. He reached out and took her free hand, his warm, strong fingers lacing with hers. My queen, whose eyes are sharper than any sword and whose heart is truer than any oath, saw the venom in his smile when all others saw only a loyal lord. She warned me, not with a tongue that can lie, but with a truth that cannot be mistaken. The court was stunned into absolute silence. They stared at the small, silent queen, seeing her for the first time not as a broken offering, but as a source of the king's power, his most secret and potent weapon. Arwen stood tall, her fear gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. She met the eyes of the court, one by one, and they looked away. Rowan then turned back to the traitors, his face hard as granite. He stripped them of their lands, their titles, and their names, banishing them to the barren rock islands of the north, a fate worse than a quick death. As they were dragged away, Rowan's voice rang out one last time. Let this be a lesson. This is my kingdom, and this is my queen. An insult to her is treason. A threat to her is a death sentence. The storm had passed. The sky, washed clean by the rain, was a canvas of bruised purple and soft, fiery orange as the sun sank into a now placid sea. They stood together on the high battlements of the iron keep, the wind a gentle caress rather than a biting gale. The trial was over, the kingdom secure. In the quiet aftermath, a new, more fragile peace was settling between them. Rowan had not let go of her hand since the trial, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. He looked out at the waves, now calm and rhythmic in their endless dance with the shore. I was a king of iron and stone, Arwen, he said, his voice soft, stripped of all its harshness and command, a voice she had never heard before. My world was loud, filled with the clash of swords and the shouts of men. It was a constant storm, and I was at its center. He turned to look at her, his stormy eyes clear and deep. I thought your silence was a weakness, a flaw. I was a fool. He lifted her hand, the one holding his, and placed it over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. Your silence. It did not add to the noise. It quieted the storm in me. It taught me to listen, not with my ears, but with this. His voice was thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. I love you, Arwen. The words, so simple, so direct, were everything she had never known she needed to hear. She looked up at him, her own eyes shining with unshed tears, but these were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She could not say the words back. She could not voice the love that was blooming in her chest. So vast and bright it threatened to consume her. But he did not need her to. He could see it in the luminous depths of her eyes, in the soft, trembling curve of her smile, in the way her entire being seemed to lean toward him. Slowly, she raised her other hand, the one that still clutched the small wooden wolf, and gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw, a silent question, a clear invitation. He lowered his head, his gaze never leaving hers, and he kissed her. The kiss was not the savage, possessive act she might once have feared from the wolf of the north. It was deep and slow and full of a profound, reverent love. It was a kiss of homecoming, of two fractured souls finding their whole in the other. It tasted of salt and wind and the end of a long war, a silent vow sealed not with words, but with a truth that was absolute. Months later, the great hall of the Iron Keep was a different place. The raw, martial energy had been tempered by a new sense of order and justice. Rowan sat upon his iron throne, but he was not alone. On a slightly smaller, but equally ornate, throne carved with intertwined wolves and doves, sat Queen Arwen. She was no longer a silent fixture, but an integral part of the reign. A heated dispute over land boundaries was brought before them. Two farmers, their faces red with anger, were shouting over each other, presenting conflicting stories of landmarks and ancestral claims. Rowan listened, his brow furrowed in concentration, the noise and conflicting claims creating a familiar kind of chaos. Arwen watched them, her gaze calm and analytical, her eyes missing nothing. She saw how one man's hands trembled when he described a certain boundary stone, how the other man's eyes flickered towards his wife in the crowd when he swore his oath. She subtly touched Rowan's arm, a light pressure that he had come to know meant she had seen something. He immediately leaned closer, his large frame inclining towards her. She lifted her hand and, in the private space between their two thrones, she began to whisper to him, not with her voice, but with her fingers, tracing letters onto the warm, calloused skin of his palm. She pointed out a detail, a contradiction in one man's story about the season a particular fence was built. A small fact lost in the shouting that she, in her world of quiet observation, had caught and held. Rowan's expression cleared. He straightened up, his gaze now sharp and focused. He addressed the petitioner, questioning him on the exact point Arwen had made. The man faltered, his blustering confidence collapsing as his lie was exposed. He stammered, contradicted himself again, and the truth became plain for all to see. Rowan delivered his judgment, fair and swift, his voice resonating with a newfound wisdom. The matter settled, he turned to Arwen, and in the midst of the crowded hall, they shared a look, a silent conversation of deep love and profound partnership that was more intimate than any spoken word. They were a team, a king of action and a queen of observation, his strength and her perception forged into a single, effective rule. The court had learned to respect the silent queen, for they knew that while the king heard their words, the queen saw their heart. Their truest kingdom, however, was not the one of stone and sea, but the one they had built in the quiet moments between the duties of the day. It resided in the conservatory, their sanctuary, the place where their connection had first taken root among the impossible blossoms. Arwen sat on the stone bench, a book of old northern legends open on her lap. Rowan sat beside her, watching her with a captivated focus. She was reading to him, but not with her voice. Her fingers, long and graceful, danced in the air, shaping the words of the story in the silent, elegant language of signs he had been diligently learning from her. He was still clumsy at it, his large, scarred hands struggling to form the delicate shapes, but he was a determined student. She told him of ancient heroes and magical beasts, her expressions as vivid as the words her hands formed. He watched, not just the story, but the storyteller, the way the light from the glass roof caught in her hair, the serene joy on her face. He reached out and placed his hand gently over hers, stilling her movement mid-sentence. The story could wait. He did not need it. He just looked at her, his heart in his eyes, a look so full of love and adoration that it was more eloquent than any poem. She smiled, a full, radiant smile of pure, unadulterated happiness, a smile he had woken from the depths of her silence. She brought his large hand to her lips and pressed a soft kiss into the center of his palm, a gesture of such complete love and acceptance that it stole his breath. They had built a world together where words were not the only way to communicate, where a shared glance held more meaning than 1,000 vows, and where the quietest person in the room could have the most powerful voice of all. The Wolf King and his Dove Queen ruled not just a kingdom of land and sea, but a kingdom of the heart, proving to the world and to each other that true love, in its purest form, speaks louder than any word ever could.